Hi, my name's Clare Baskerville. I'm an artist and arts educator with diverse needs and university students. Recently I was very lucky to have a residency with Spudworks in Sway in the New Forest. I'd like to share with you over the next 10 minutes or so memories of my time there and to perhaps give you an insight into the way that different artists work. I hope you enjoy it. Spud is an arts and education charity creating opportunities for artists to engage with architecture, the environment and the public. Their creative hub, Spudworks, is based in Sway in the New Forest. To settle anywhere, it's good to get the domestics organised, so I spent as much time as possible outside, lived as creatively as I could, as a way of embodied thinking. What does it mean to live as part of this place? I cooked outside, made a washing line, even cut my hair and hung it up for the birds, and developed a sense of a kindred spirit with the maple tree and the early morning squirrels. I decorated my table and made a brooch with a jay feather that I was delighted to find. I then broadened my horizons and allowed the compass to inform my walks, using the tracks but also wandering off and just following north or west, finding my own walk lines. I enjoyed the feeling of getting lost and finding my own way back. I made my own dens and explored other people's, using orange ropes to look at line and form as a way of drawing, but in the world itself, and explore the world of the idea of shelter and what it means to have shelter. The weather was turning to autumn more and more, and the nights were drawing in, and I wandered round the forest, rekindling my hunter-gatherer, which led to hours picking sloes and making gin in preparation for Christmas. I prepared the seeds from my sunflowers for the birds, and a wild apple tree dropped all its apples after a windy night, so I made jelly, which actually wasn't very nice. But it pulled on my resourcefulness, and I used a bucket and I made a sieve out of a scrap of fabric and some twigs, which then have formed a series of delicately balanced sculptures. Storing and preparing are recurrent themes in my work, as is the precarity of balance expressed by the branches. The spirit of the forest seemed to change as autumn closed in. The days were still warm, but mist hung in the valley at dawn. Spiders showcased their genius on the gorse bushes, and the sun began to be lower in the sky. Daily life can push and pull us to do, and I began to feel a magnetic pull to just go and be, and bathe in some of that restful quiet, where fungi were emerging and ants were going about their daily routine. I saw and felt the season change, each plant slightly different after another chilly night, but there was a sense of time just passing and an abundance of so many things to collect and press and take home and become fascinated with. By October, I was holding small art sessions with some local primary school children, in which we embraced the coming darker months, foraged, celebrated Halloween, and then explored using soft pine needles to make brushes and dip them in paint and make marks. I was also still working at local diverse needs community. We made autumn conker spirals and then took this inspiration into paper mosaics, feather collage and other works. My studio was filling up, and the process of drying and pressing leaves was taking on a life of its own. There seemed to be an active sense of being attentive to the seasons each day, this gathering and pressing of leaves, bringing the outside in with such care and repetition, and turning and drying, and it was almost becoming a meditation practice of its own. This led to a work called 4,000 Breaths, which I did by candlelight one evening, which was wild and stormy, and I was appreciating the roof for sheltering me from the storm. All the leaves were from one single silver birch tree, which I collected when they were yellow, and they gradually turned brown with the drying process. I placed each leaf on a breath, each leaf like a tiny tree in a tiny world of its own. Most of my work has an ephemeral nature, The materials are returned back to where I found them, and the documentation is all that remains. I began to learn about the habitats required for the smaller occupants of the forest. This elongated stump has been left as standing deadwood to support insect life. For me, it offered a chance to sit on a natural sundial and feel the sun as it moved around us, to listen to the trees creaking in the wind and experience the precarity of it all, perched up there. Familiar now with parts of the forest, but a bit overwhelmed, to be honest, by the news in the wider world at the time and how best to use this residency. I felt drawn to a really statuesque pine that overlooked a generous grassy valley. She looked different at different times of the day, and there were subtle lines on the ground that led to her, and she seemed to act as a waymarker for both people and animals. I wasn't quite sure why, I just kept wanting to go back. In the end, I went at dawn and dusk, most days for 5 months, often on the way to or from work. It was almost like a slow courtship, a getting to know each other. Some days were sunny, some days the branches were coming off in the winds, and I was just playful with rope lines and wire, shadows, made a pinecone bird scarer, and just watched and sat with the tree. I felt I just wanted to be there, and it's hard for us humans to just be, so I indulged my need to do something. Lines and sticks always catch my eyes, so I started rearranging the fallen pine needles, responding to the shapes around me and the roots and the branches on the ground, and leaving these subtle changes for walkers to encounter. Autumn was really beautiful. There were huge skies and heavy dews. The pine needles were actually getting a bit soggy, so I started gathering them each day, purposely taking bedliners whenever I went to sit up there. It kind of became a framework within which to fully engage with the weather and the season. I was now coming to the tree, and it was about gathering, but it was also becoming a much wider experience. I'm not one for looking at weather forecasts, and the tree stood there in all weathers, and so could I. It became about just turning up and a sense of ease around that commitment. Each time I went to the tree, more needles were on the floor, a bit like the present that keeps on giving. So I kept gathering and bringing the needles back to the studio, which took on the aroma of the forest floor and a wonderful blurring of definition between indoors and outdoors. A production line system soon emerged. After drying, they'd be bagged up. Then the unwanted grass and sticks would be taken out, and then they'd be bundled, tied, and stacked, and neatly boxed to keep them safe. My hands knew every pine needle intimately. The long, darker evenings were actually as enchanting as the days. I really loved punctuating the dark with the candles and sitting on the ground under a tarpaulin, listening and sometimes watching the forest at night. It was such a gift to have the time to begin to learn more about the stars above my head. I embraced the dark of the studio in the evening and made ink with leaves and fungi, and used pine needles to scratch texture into the papers. And then I painted, and I let my imagination run and painted dreams and continued to experiment. I drew from the sound recordings that I'd taken from the forest, experimented with some rough pewter casting, and used pine needles to do the I Ching with. I began to enjoy even the less spectacular dawns, finding the subtle beauty in the soft greys and the formation of the clouds. There was often chance company from early morning dog walkers and runners too. The ground around the tree became as familiar as the floor at home, with my meticulous combing for needles, and each day I found tiny fungi surprises too. It was a really lovely sense of abundance. Dawn and dusk rose and fell, spectacular or not, the animals just going about their business, apart from the odd curious cow. Back at the studio, the drying and bundling production line was still going, and I worked until I had enough. Enough was decided on what felt right. I deliberately didn't count how many bundles I had. It all seemed rather irrelevant, as the tree doesn't quantify output in that way. The exhibition at Spudworks was ready for installation. Sadly, the exhibition didn't go ahead due to lockdown restrictions. The work on the back wall, the coloured work, is by Madison Collymore, and Denise Poot was also due to join us and show work. Hopefully the exhibition will go ahead in November this year. Outside, wild, windy, wintry weather had set in, and the tree just seemed to elegantly weather each storm. I marked the solstice with a candle, and I could swear that I felt time incrementally turning in my chest. And then it was Christmas. I'd shared the forest by sending my daughters homemade advent calendars to their city lives in London, bringing all the carefully collected and pressed elements over the months to hang together again and mark time. My time in the forest came to a rather abrupt end due to lockdown restrictions, but I am also happy to be back based by the sea. I'm continuing to make work from my experiences, starting by using a projection of the tree and exploring some preliminary mark-making ideas, from which I'm sure I will generate a body of drawn work. When I look back over my time spent in the forest, trying to climb inside what the tree sees over a season, I'm struck by the steadfastness of something standing completely in agreement with its surroundings. This experience wasn't about the acquisition of scientific knowledge, and I still haven't even tried to age the tree. And it wasn't about illustrating what my eyes could see, but it was about just finding a way of just being with the forest, which seemed to blossom through this relationship with a tree. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you to Spudworks for the wonderful opportunity.